Good evening, everyone. Delighted to see you all here. Welcome to Goldsmiths. I'm really delighted to introduce this year's Weinrebe lecture, which is a semi-annual collaboration between the Goldsmiths Writers' Centre and the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. I'm going to just really briefly introduce our guests and then hand over to them. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And at the conclusion of proceedings, please join us for a drink in the balcony, which is just down there, turn around and up the stairs, where you will also be able to buy books from our lovely bookseller, David. So, we are joined this evening by Olivia Laing, an internationally acclaimed writer and critic. They're the author of 8 books, including The Lonely City, Everybody, and the Sunday Times #1 bestseller, The Garden Against Time. Lang's first novel, Crudo, won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and in 2018 they were awarded the Wyndham Campbell Prize for non-fiction. They're an honorary fellow of the Royal Academy of Arts, and their books have been translated into 21 languages. Their most recent novel, which will be the main focus of tonight's discussion, is The Silver Book. Olivia will be in conversation with Dr. Charlie Lee Potter, an award-winning writer, poet and artist, and our representative from the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, or OCLU, as I've discovered this evening, we call ourselves. She's a former BBC foreign correspondent, presenter of BBC Radio 4's PM, The World at One and Open Book. Charlie is the recipient of the International Créateurs Prize for Creative Journalism, and her podcast, Inside a Mountain, has been shortlisted for the International Women's Podcast Awards. She holds 2 doctorates and is a lecturer in English at Hertford College, Oxford. Her poetry collection, A Line is a Breathless Length, will be published this winter. So please join me in giving a huge round of applause and welcome.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great that you're all here. Will you just shout if you suddenly can't hear? It's easier if you say rather than sit seething at the back. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Olivia's work. I would describe you as, and I hope you like this description, as a virtuosic writer. There's a sort of glory to each experiment that you launch on your audience, which is, what form is it taking? Is it memoir? No, it's not. Is it life writing? Perhaps it's not. Is it cultural criticism? Maybe it is. Is it memoir impersonating the novel and vice versa? Possibly none or some of those things, but I'd be really interested for you to contextualise our whole discussion now by saying, what you think it is that you have been doing all this time. This extraordinary review of a range of books.
That's a really tough question. I think those are all sort of tools on the way to something else, which is, they're really sort of philosophical investigations of different areas of human experience. So To the River is very much about memory and loss and history, and A Trip to Echo Spring is about trying to understand alcoholism. The Lonely City is obviously about loneliness. Crudo is trying to make sense of a contemporary moment. Everybody is about embodiment. So they have these sort of large, not exactly issues, but themes, and then memoir, biography and cultural criticism approaches the different ways that I can slice into that subject. So I never want to get caught up in writing something that fits entirely and comfortably into any of those, because they're all really tools, practical tools that I can enter a subject and also tell a story within a subject to keep the subject being interesting to the reader from multiple different directions.
Well, the focus, obviously, for the main part of our conversation is the Silver Book, which is this handsome creature here. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, again, it's got this wonderful way of, it sort of shimmers between states of being. So it's real. There's lots of stuff in it that real events, real film directors, real films. But then there's this wonderful sort of fictional intersection with the real, with this 22-year-old character, Nicholas, this beautiful, naive young man who may or may not be implicated in somebody's death. But you then invent a queer love story for this invented character, Nicholas, to have with the real character, who is the costume designer, Donati. I find it really interesting to consider the point at which life writing is able to borrow from the fictional. I just wondered how you went about actually constructing this very intricate form.
Yeah, this book felt really risky to me to write because I'm predominantly a non-fiction writer and because my first novel was very much about the real. It's very much a sort of version of my own life and kind of spliced with Kakiaka. So the fictional element in that is just realisation. It's just bringing two real things together and seeing what happens. With this book, I was very clear that it is truly a novel. It is fictional. It is an invented narrative. It's got a sort of dramatic arc. But that is absolutely set in a real world. This is a real world of Italy in the 1930s, cinema in the 1970s, and the characters in it are, not just real, but very visible and well-known people. Fellini and Pasolini, Donati to a lesser extent, and that felt like a sort of mad gamble that I wasn't sure I'd be able to pull off at all. I wasn't sure I'd be able to make them sort of walk and talk, because what I would do if I was writing non-fiction is much more like I would do lots of research. I would tell you what's factual about their lives. I would tell you where the gaps are. I would tell you what isn't known. But I would never dream of filling those spaces in. That would feel to me like a really transgressive thing to do within non-fiction. And I know there's lots of non-fiction writers who do like to make those spaces, but I've very much not done that. So with this, I wanted to do something risky. I wanted to do it because I had started feeling like non-fiction can't quite do justice to the times that we're in, to the strangeness of the times that we're in, to the assault on truth of the times that we're in. And I wanted to inhabit the heart of that story. I wanted to write about sex and love and desire, and I wanted to think about people's internal worlds. I wanted to think about the artists in the book's internal worlds, their motivations, their sense of their own history. And there was no way I could do that within non-fiction. So I had to sort of leap. And like you say, Nicholas was my way. I invented this character and I injected him into a world. And then I suppose my rules were that if I described something real, it had to be accurate. But within that stricture, I could imagine freely what would happen if he talks to this person, what happens if he overhears this thing, what happens if he kisses this person.
It's a beautiful exercise in actually constructing a narrative, and part of the way that you do that is by building up a series of doubles, kind of each reflecting the other. So you've got lots of pairings and lots of people themselves being divided into two. So Nicholas talks about himself, thinks of himself as two people. He's both a beautiful, happy boy, but he's also despicable, and that relates to this event that has taken place as the novel starts. It becomes apparent later what that thing is. So he's doubled. Donati describes himself as a two-part person. You've got Fellini doubled with Pasolini. You've even managed to really accentuate the doubling in the film work that goes on itself. So Venice is actually twinned with a simulacrum of Venice, because whole Venice is built in Cinecittà, which is the movie lot, and it's about 100 acres, it's huge, in Rome. They actually decide to make Venice look more like Venice. They'll build a kind of doppelganger of Venice. So in terms of that construction of doubles, how conscious were you in kind of ticking off the twos, or do they just happen?
No, not conscious at all. And it's interesting because as I've started to have, the book only came out beginning of November, so I've just started having these conversations, and it was published simultaneously in Italy, but the title is different. It's called Specchio Argento, which is the silver mirror. So of course those conversations were very much about doubles, because everyone thought intentionally it had been called the silver mirror. But actually it hadn't. It was the publishers who said, what's this silver book? It doesn't make any sense. We don't say silver screen, so it's nonsense. But it made me realise that exactly what you say, that it is a book full of doubles and reflections and sinister reflections. But of course, art is a silver mirror of reality. Everyone who's engaged in the process of making art is engaged in making these mirrors of reality. And it is very much about these two men, Pasolini and Fellini, making these sort of extraordinarily strange films that are a mirror to their times. Fellini's mirror perhaps more private, and Pasolini's mirror very much a political mirror of the world that he recognised in the past and the world that he thought was coming to being in the future, which is the world we live in now.
And that doubling of the two films, both of them 18th century texts, but both of them in their way, a despairing look at just that excessive desire for stuff and for things and for consumerism. They're not in any way a kind of paean to pleasure or indulgence. They're bleak, shocking films, but very, very different in their way. I did keep noticing also, though, little nods in the direction of Death in Venice, because Nicholas is so beautiful, this 22-year-old boy, more or less. He says at one stage that he goes to a fancy dress party dressed as Tadzio in the sailor top. There's that sense, I think, also that with Donati at one stage suddenly says, do I look a fat, ridiculous, middle-aged man in love with this pretty thing? So there's these kind of subliminal references to cinema throughout. So it is a kind of love song to film.
It is, and also it's that endless desire of the writer to make something that's visual. You're working in language, you're trapped inside language, and if you're somebody like me who's a very visual person, you're always longing to create the actual spectacle, and you can't. So I think this book is as close as I've come to really almost indulge in that, trying to make something that you see. And it's funny, people keep saying to me, yeah, when I was watching your book, no, you didn't watch it, you did read it. But I think because it's set up almost as if it's scene after scene that is described as if you're seeing it. It is really, it's a pretend film.
That's exactly
it's
how,
a pretend
how
film
it
that's
is.
about film.
Yeah, it's again, that's another kind of double. It's about and is. I'm initially reading it thinking, how is Olivia managing to be so specific about the colour of leaves in Rome that month? How is Olivia managing to describe the Borghese gardens so specifically? And then, of course, I realised you'd written the entire thing at the British School of Rep. And do you think you could have actually written it without being there?
Absolutely no way. And that was a really interesting stealing from reality. So I'm stealing from historical reality in the research process, but also I really wanted Rome in particular, Venice too, but Rome in particular to be a character in the book. And the writing process, I wrote it between September and November last year in a real sort of white heat. So I'd write long hours, but I would nip out into the Borghese, or I would nip down to the river, or I would walk through to Shostal, where Nicholas and Danilo buy their pyjamas, and just take what was offered to me from the city and put it straight into the book. There's this scene where I described Danilo standing in Cinecittà, talking with one hand on his hip, and actually I was walking through town from Piazza Popolo into town, and I saw basically a workman, somebody who had been spending the day plastering, come out, and he just stood with one hand on his hip, very sexy, very unselfconscious, but he was kind of paunch, he looked like, he had that very Roman face, and he was kind of camp and just incredibly attractive without being facially attractive at all. And that's a Danilo body, here I'm being given something. So I would take things like that constantly.
I think one of the most, and I know a lot of you here, possibly most of you here, are creative writing students. I think one of the most misguided pieces of advice for any kind of creative writing student, whether fiction or non-fiction, and I don't know what you think about it.
I know what you're going to say.
You do, don't you? It drives me mad.
Are you going to say, write what you know?
I am.
Oh.
I think it's the most absurd thing.
Find out.
Find
Enter
out.
the world. Writing is a way to enter the world. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I can't bear it because it keeps you parochial and safe. Writing is a sort of journey out into finding more and more about the world, and that's what's thrilling about it. Why would you want to write what you already know? Every single one of these books is you trying to discover something.
And I think that is what is so powerful and energetic about all of these books. They are literally just overflowing with information which seems exciting to you in the writing of, and certainly is exciting to us in the reading of. And there's no substitute for actually doing research and finding stuff out so that you don't become limited. What I wondered though is, with the describing of the costumes and the scenes, so the Danilo Donati is costume designer but also set designer.
Yeah.
How did you do that research? Because it's so vivid what you're describing, the giant papier-mâché whale with a giantess sitting inside. And the costumes and the detail that you're providing about the special effects is quite remarkable.
So, obviously I'm somebody who loves research, and that's been the backbone of all of my books, and I wanted this to have that same sort of feeling. So I spent a lot of time watching documentaries, and especially, this is a strange process, but I took a lot of screenshots from documentaries. Sometimes I'd be watching something about Fellini, and Donati would walk past at the back of the shot, like just on his way somewhere else, and I'd grab it and I'd have a screenshot, and then I'd be like, what kind of shoes is he wearing? Just to be able to sort of peer into the back of those rooms. And then I had this amazing stroke of luck, really, which is when I was in Rome, I realised that all of the costumes that Donati made, which is mostly for Pasolini films, but for Fellini as well, were at this place called Sartoria Ferrari, which it's not open to the public, but it still makes clothes for opera and for theatre. And I went on a deep dive to try and work out like who to contact to get into it. And I found somebody called Clara Tosi Pamphili, who's actually Piero Tosi, who made Death and Venice's costumes, daughter. But she's much more interested in Donati, the great artist costumier. And we, thank God for Instagram, we had Instagram friends in common, so I just messaged everyone that we had in common, which is quite a lot of people, it was like 11 people. And then they all messaged her, so she was like, why am I getting all these things from this crazy English person? And then there was this bizarre coincidence, so I finally got her number, and I called her and I said, I'm in Rome, can I come and see the costumes? And she said, yeah, but I'm installing them in Berlin today. Where are you and where will you be? And I said, I'm in an airport, I'm at Rome Airport on my way to Berlin. So it was one of those beautiful sort of coincidences where you kind of know you're on the right track. And I met her in Berlin, she showed me the costumes, and then I went back to Rome, went to Ferrari, and they sat me on a chair, and they, Luigi Piccolo, who's the sort of new Danilo, and a couple of other of Donati's friends, and Clara sat opposite me like an interview panel, and they said, with a translator, what do you want with us? Why are you here? What's your approach to Donati? What are you doing? Who are you? And I kind of sat there quaking, going, I just really like him, and I'm going to do this weird thing that you probably think is terribly transgressive, and then I've made him have this love affair. And they just didn't smile. It was terrifying. And then eventually I kind of cracked them, and they were like, okay, we'll show you all the clothes, we'll tell you all the gossip. So that was an amazing bit of luck.
Amazing serendipity.
Yeah.
So should we? I'd love you to read a bit from the book. You so cleverly with this beautiful red-headed Nicholas, age 22. We are kind of encountering film, cinema, the movie set, and the costumes through his eyes, because it's all new and exciting to him. So this particular section is him just looking and trying to work out what he's actually seeing. So there you go. Let me give your book to you.
So this is Nico. He's arrived at Cinecittà, and it's all just this whole world. He's fallen in love with Donati in Venice, and that was like, okay, there's just the two of us. This is kind of a private thing. This is very exciting. But now suddenly he's in this world, and Donati is the master of this world. So it's frightening, but it's also thrilling. At lunchtime, he sometimes leaves the cafeteria and goes exploring on the back lot. The land has reverted to meadow, acre after acre of weeds and wild flowers. You can find all kinds of things out there, dumped and forgotten among the willow herb and wild carrot. A litter of kittens asleep in a spaceship, chickens scratching at the foot of a Roman aqueduct. He walks to the pool, currently drained, big enough, as Danilo said, for 12 shipwrecks. He is hailed when he returns to the workshop. Nico, you're fast. Take this over to sculpture. Mozzo, they've started to call him. It means cabin boy, gopher. Bottom of the heap, sure, but part of the team. He loves the sculpture shop. It's like someone sacked Rome and brought it all here. There are columns and gods, innumerable boys playing discus or posing on their plinths. There are no broken noses, no missing fingers. Every limb is intact, unlike in the museums. Slowly, Danilo's set is accumulating. There are people building all those rooms, all those pieces of furniture they drew in Venice. Nicholas's favourite thing is to creep into Studio 5 and take a disorientating grand tour around a half-cast 18th century where nothing will ever quite be finished. The pragmatic economy of film construction. Rooms with missing walls give way to rooms with missing ceilings, so that you step from half a theatre into a quarter of a palazzo. None of the buildings have yet been dressed. This pantomime city, with its impossible architecture, exerts a powerful pull on his imagination. He is always finding excuses to slip inside, to linger.
Lovely, thank you. What you may or may not have noticed, and I didn't actually notice until quite late on, the entire novel is written in the dramatic present tense, which again
I didn't notice that either. Somebody pointed that out.
that might be another bit of advice that you're given. Don't use the present tense because it's really clumsy. But there's an urgency to your dramatic present tense. And at times I felt almost as though the text itself was slanting off to the right, urging me to kind of read faster and faster. It seemed to have a different shape on the page almost because of the extraordinary pace. But I find that really interesting that you didn't even know that you were doing that.
No, I think I had a conversation with myself at the beginning where I thought, this is high risk. Well, let's just see what happens. Am I going to... Because the danger is that you box yourself into a corner because you can't keep making things happen. But I think because I was basically writing it as if I was writing down a film and I was describing it scene by scene, it actually worked because things did keep happening. And also it kind of conveys something about Nico's, the immediacy. He's not looking back on this. It's all unknown ahead of him. And that felt really crucial to convey. So it would have been very difficult to do it in the past tense because where was he reporting from?
Interesting that, yes, to go with your instinct as well as go by the advice that you're given or the things you're told not to do.
I always go by instinct. It's all instinct.
Yeah, that's how it feels, that raw energy that just pours from this page. The other thing I noticed about Nicholas, and I don't know if it was apparent to you at the time, but in Funny Weather, which is this one, which I really recommend, and then, didn't mean to drop Crudo, sorry Crudo, and then this one, Lonely City. Well, to be honest, they're all marvellous. But you seem to have this wonderful affection for an artist called David Wojnarowicz, who had the bleakest of childhoods and was a remarkable and brave man, but had a very bleak life. Died eventually from AIDS-related illnesses. But it seemed to me, you describe him as being extremely inarticulate and kind of young and naive, inarticulate because he was confronted by things he didn't understand or didn't know, but he has a kind of bravery about him too. I kept finding that David was emerging from here in the guise of Nicholas.
Oh, so interesting. I see them as such different beings. Because Weinrebe is driven by fury, just utter hatred and contempt of everything around him, and sort of desire to find a world where he can not even decide to find a world, just this drive to speak up against, to speak truth about the grimness of the world he's inside. So that sense of his anger is just above all his character to me, whereas Nico isn't somebody who's angry, he's somebody who is much more porous and much more open-ended, mysterious. And before I started writing it, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking it would be a kind of Talented Mr. Ripley narrative. I was thinking that, because I'd been thinking about this thriller that I wanted to write for a long time, and I was thinking that he would be quite a malevolent character, that he'd be somebody who was manipulative and very much a cuckoo, somebody who lands in other people's lives, wreaks a kind of havoc, and wanders off sort of untouched by it. And when I started writing it, that person vanished instantly, and this boy arrived who was very naive, very open to the world, very sort of changeable and malleable. And that character really fascinated me. But David to me feels like a person of real solidity, who knows his own mind in all the terrible situations he finds himself in.
I think David, he used to walk the length of Manhattan at night, didn't he? Smashing every single
Smashing
glass
the phone
pane
book,
in
yeah.
every phone box that he could find.
Nicholas would never do that.
Nicholas would
never.
I think what I meant by the connection for me as I
But
read
the
the book,
young, yeah.
it was your tenderness towards them. That's what I kept finding. Because you write
Yeah.
about David in such a kind of protective
David
way.
is more like a Danilo, actually. I think
Interesting.
they're closer because that sense of somebody who has the drive to make, has the drive to create no matter what, and that sense of sort of pride in their work and determination in the both of them living under sort of appalling homophobia, and this is how I'm going to live, this is how I'm not going to repress or hide my sexuality. So I think I'd put them, even though there's the age difference, I think I'd put them closer together.
That affection for Nicholas and David, it feels very palpable to me, that you're almost protective of them both, it seems.
Interesting, because in a way I feel more protective of Danilo and Pasolini, but I think their vulnerabilities are very clear on page, let's put it like that.
Yeah.
I think with both of them there's that sense of vulnerability, but no, it's interesting. It's interesting hearing how other people perceive it and how I sort of imagined it, because there's always a gap between those two things.
Always.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Pasolini and Fellini. So Fellini, director, he's quite manipulative. He wants everybody to love him. He actually is extremely cruel to the actors on set. Donald Sutherland has a terrible time doing repeated takes of a scene in which he gets soaking wet again and again and again, and it's done almost just for the sake of it, because Fellini can. Pasolini, very different kind of character, a very different kind of film. How many people, I'd be amazed if it's many, if any, how many people have seen the Pasolini film Salò? Oh, you're better than me. I really believe in research, Olivia, but I couldn't bring myself to watch
Do you know what?
the film.
I didn't watch it at the beginning of writing the book, because
That's what I was going
it
to
occurred
ask
to
you.
me that none of the people making it had watched it.
So you couldn't either.
So it was absolutely fine for me to go, okay, they're putting something together. In fact, the cast and crew had absolutely no idea what film they were making, and when they saw it, they were very, very shocked, because it was a very fun set. People had a great time on it, and they didn't really put it together. Though I struggle to understand that, because there is an awful lot of torture and death in it, but somehow they thought it was less horrific
That
and
comes
less
across.
chilling
Yeah.
than it
It's
actually
so
turned out to be.
palpable in the novel. How can they be having such a lovely time putting pretend turds on people's sandwiches? Because that's one of the key parts of the film. Sorry, everybody, if you think you'd watch it, you might not wish to watch it now. I don't know.
I think it helps to know that it
Maybe
is
be
chocolate.
prepared. But that sort of sense of hilarity and sort of solidarity with each other, they're all, that's not done at Cinecittà, that's done on location.
Yeah.
And they're pretty much living in this place together, closeted together. And it's based on Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom. Again, that'll give you some clues for those who haven't actually seen the film. But yeah, they seem to be having a really good time. So why don't you read that section? This involves the turds on sandwiches kind of territory, but they're obviously loving it.
I read this in Rome the other day, which was very fun to do. At breakfast, the conversation is about shit. The middle part of the film is titled The Cycle of Excrement, for obvious Sardian reasons. Since many people will be participating in the eating of shit, the special effects team need to find a way of making a palatable substitute. Sergio is describing to Danny his experiments so far. Chocolate, of course, mixed with broken biscuits. The problem is that even the finest Swiss melts under the lights. And the consistency, it isn't quite right. No, Danny says thoughtfully, you need something glossy. Olive oil? Okay, what about marmalade to bind it? This is the most disgusting conversation I've ever heard, Nico says, reaching for a crostata. They both look at him, surprised. Most of the time my job is making heads that explode, Sergio says, or eyes that burst. I mean, wait till you see the end of this film. Personally, I think a scalping It's much nastier than a few turds. Nicholas picks up his pastry and backs away from the table. I'm eating, he says. It's totally gross. We'll put you on turd duty, Sergio says. And then, turning to Danny, but the real problem is how to shape them. You can't just pat them. They have to be extruded. Welcome to cinema, Danny shouts at Nicholas's retreating back. We're not perverts, we're labourers in the dream factory.
There's a very kind of pre-echo in a way of this, the terrible, terrible things that go on in both in Desade's text but also in the film. There's a funny kind of pre-echo, actually, when there's a New Year's dinner that you describe. I swear I could cook that dinner just by reading your instructions. But there's something so kind of visceral about the recipes that you choose. So there's a sauce which is chocolate mixed with blood, which seems to be the perfect kind of emblematic hint that there's going to be lots of chocolate and blood coming later. And then sausage meat being stuffed into a pig's trotter. It's so explicit. What was the research for that? You must have done research for that.
That is all out of a cookbook in, what's she called? Is it Anna Bodoni?
I can't remember. Might well be, yes, I think so.
I think it's called Northern Italian Cooking by Anna Bodoni, and I went through it and I thought, okay, I want recipes from the place where Danilo's from, which is near Mantua, and some Roman recipes, and I put together this meal, but it would definitely have been in his mind that he'd want, it was for Pasolini for New Year, for good luck on the film. So I imagined that he would love those little nods towards the film that they were all about to make together. But I also wanted it's like this sort of archway in the middle of the book, that meal. It's like time really slows down. It's the end of the sort of beautiful romance and you're moving into something darker. There's a lot of momentum happening, and I wanted to just pause and make it kind of glacially slow, of just having Danilo in his own command of time. He's a magician, he's an alchemist, he's somebody who has this sort of extraordinary capacity to make magic. And so you have these 2 days where he's cooking this meal, very elaborate, very slow, I want this and I want that, and that's a sort of portrait of his whole being inside the making of the meal. But also it's like the last little pause before everything starts to move much, much faster.
The film was actually not shown until after Pasolini's death. This isn't a plot spoiler for the book, because Pasolini was murdered most brutally before the film came out. He had his car was driven over him. I won't go into details. It's sort of in the book, but this is another of these kind of conundrums that you were faced with. That this was an element of key life writing.
Yes.
Being true to Pasolini's murder, you couldn't do some kind of dreadful, counterfactual, counter-historical novel in which somehow he survives. He doesn't. He
Although
dies.
actually I think some readers think that he might survive. And certainly if you don't know who he is and what's going to happen, you can read it almost to the last minute and think, I don't know what's going to happen here. And I wanted it to have those levels. I wanted you to be able to read it and think, these are all fictional characters. Or to read it and think, I know these people inside out, and oh look, there are these details that I really appreciate.
So what was the thinking there then? You want people to think that they're all real, or perhaps...
No. I just wanted it to be able to be open to people. I didn't want it to be something where, if you don't know these 1970s Italian film directors, this book will mean nothing to you. I wanted it to be super accessible. So I wanted all the time to give enough information so you didn't have to come with your own information. And I wanted it to feel that if you knew what was going to happen to Pasolini, you had this sense of looming dread, but if you didn't know that, it was completely open. You might think that there was going to be... In fact, one of my friends who did know what was going to happen said, I thought there was going to be a happy ending. Sorry, now I have done a spoiler. Maybe there is a happy ending, but there is a
beyond
death.
the last page.
But just to go back to something you were just saying, I initially thought, while I was writing it, that I would have that death enacted in front of the reader, that we would watch that, and I realised that I couldn't do that felt really transgressive, to have this murder sort of, which is very grisly and gory, to have that witnessed. And that, to cast right back to my first book, was a decision that I also made when I was writing To the River. which is a journey down the river that Virginia Woolf drowned in. And I didn't want to have the moment of her walking into the river. The money shot of that book would have been, you know, she kills herself. I imagine her walking in. And I just found that grotesque, really horrible. So what I did instead was to try and kind of draw a penumbra, to try and make a circle around it of witness reports. I really focused on the kids who found her body. They thought it was a fur coat floating in the water, or Leonard's diary, or these sort of different archival things that could be almost arranged like a kind of stone circle, like something around this awful absence. So you have a feeling of the awful absence, but you don't actually do this sort of, I don't know, slightly disgraceful act of imagining somebody's last moments. And that came back to me with Pasolini. It felt like the same thing. And actually with Weinrebe as well in The Lonely City. I'm in an archive and I'm looking at all of these materials, the hospital bracelet, the prescription, the medicine bottle, because it's a really detailed archive. And I thought that was enough. You don't have to actually imagine this person, you know, emaciated and covered in sores dying. You don't have to do that on the page. You can allow all of that weight to land without doing something that feels like you're actually stealing from the person.
And I think in that instance that there's yet more weight to come, in the sense that you then document what happened to his ashes, which was all those people protesting about the lack of care, the lack of attention, the lack of kindness shown by the American government of the time under Bush. That blame is to be laid at the political system's door, and actually his ashes were then taken, and his friends and all those who were complaining about that lack of care, they took his ashes and they actually scattered them on the White House lawn. So David is there as a last final triumphal bleak protest, which was a beautiful way of dressing it. It's so powerful and so beautifully addressed in your book. That is the thing that you choose to make our eyes focus on.
Yeah, so the sort of aftermath, the prelude and the aftermath, but not the incident itself. And it does seem to me interesting. It wasn't just David's ashes. It was the ashes of hundreds and hundreds of people. It was called the Ashes Action. People marched on Washington, and I do think there's something about that being Trump's White House now, and yet all of those people's last remains are still there. Whatever kind of spell that they can cast, whatever power they exert, they are still there.
And bear in mind, of course, that only yesterday Trump banned World AIDS Memorial Day. So, you know, the things that you are highlighting throughout your books, and there's a wonderful conversation that goes on, I think, between your books in a really interesting way, that those conversations continue to kind of leap from the page that is still relevant to us now. And we'll talk about that at the end. But in the meantime, just to go back to Pasolini, I noted that you have in Danilo's voice, you have concern expressed that because of the brutality of his murder and the fact that he'd pick up young men in bars pretty much every night, there's an awful lot of cruising in this novel, that Danilo is anxious. And I think this actually did happen in real life, beyond the pages of this novel, that somehow people would pluck the idea of Pasolini's behaviour and somehow then destroy the film. There was one French reviewer, for example, who said that they thought that actually the film itself of Salò should be presented as evidence for the defence against the person who was arrested, although people don't believe he committed the crime now, but he was in court. And if the film could then be shown as evidence on behalf of this accused man, then people would just say, well, Pasolini, he was just asking to be murdered. And it completely undercut the power and the import and the purpose of that film.
I feel very strongly that what Pasolini was doing in his final year was issuing warnings in multiple different ways. He was writing columns in Corriere, the big Italian newspaper, that spoke extremely explicitly about the changes he felt were happening in Italy and the dangers that he thought were coming. He thought that fascism was returning. He thought that it wasn't returning looking like it had done in the 1930s and 40s. He thought it had melded into a new form by becoming superimposed with capitalism. He thought that that desire to own at all costs was poisoning Italian society, it was poisoning the ecology, it was poisoning the social fabric, it was poisoning cultural life. These are warnings, I think, that really have come to pass. And he said more than that. He started to talk about political corruption in Italy. This is the Anni di Piombi, the years of lead, where there was a lot of far-right and far-left terrorism. And he said that he knew who was responsible. He knew who was responsible for multiple bombings. He knew what was happening in Italy, and that he was going to name names in the novel that he was writing called Petrolio. So then he makes Salò. He makes this film which I really think is a warning, not just about fascism. It's a film that has perpetrators and it has victims, and I think the real import of that film is about the victims. He's saying that there are grave dangers to two things: compliance and complicity. So it is this really visceral, powerful warning about a kind of system that he felt that we were becoming embedded in, and that he thought was going to become more and more powerful. Now, Pasolini is murdered, and the murder looks as if he's been killed by a rent boy, by a boy he's picked up and paid to have sex with him. And certainly what Danilo is saying in the book, which is in fact what I think, this book isn't all statements of things that I also think, but this very much is. It is an extremely clever murder. If Pasolini had been assassinated, if he'd been shot in the head, mafia style, he would have become a martyr, and his work would have been regarded with more and more attention. If he's made to seem to die in this way, if it's made to seem that he went out seeking his own death, that his death was trashy, that it was to do with a kind of sexuality that perhaps longed for violence, that makes him a pariah, which is what happened, but it also makes this film this dangerous warning, this sort of frightening, visionary account, apocalyptic account of a future that he saw coming. It makes that seem as if it's a kind of pornography, as if it's just about Pasolini's own sexual fantasies to be harmed, to be violated, which, for the record, I don't think were Pasolini's sexual fantasies. So if there's a sort of, this is an intensely political book, like all of my books, and that is the truth message, I suppose, that I very much wanted to have. It's a fictional book, but inside it is really what I think happened to Pasolini and why I think it happened to Pasolini.
In a way, I think that very first question I asked you, I should probably have included in terms of the kind of territory with which you deal. I should probably have included political manifesto as well, because there is a kind of urgency about the way that you write and the warnings that you're giving throughout your books. And what I found rereading them all in sequence last week in one long whoosh is that you keep sending characters ahead. So you might have David Voronovich, we've talked about him already, but he keeps appearing in one book, and then there he is again. Andy Warhol is in another, and there he is again. But what you do with Crudo, which is your first novel, which is this one, you actually send the Marquis de Sade on ahead from here, and here he is here.
Well, he's in everybody's novel. I'd forgotten he was in Crudo. I'd completely forgotten that.
It's like you're saying, pay attention, pay attention, because this man is coming back, and indeed, of course he does. Do you want to just read that from Crudo? Because it's very, very striking, this wonderful slippage between your texts, let alone within texts.
I find the Marquis de Sade, this isn't the reading, I'm just talking. I find the Marquis de Sade unbearable to read, and yet I feel all the time that he has a message that we need to pay attention to. Often that's what I'm doing with my books. I'm going back to somebody that I feel like we need to pay attention to. Something got discarded along the way. It needs to be picked up and handed back into our moment. If there's anything that drives me in writing, it's that. Somewhere along the way, Cathy had read an essay comparing the sexual excesses of the Marquis de Sade's novels to an office. This is such an amazing essay. The pursuit of both was apathy, hierarchy, repetition, endless bureaucracy. The article compared the libertines in 100 Days of Sodom to the management committee, the children to interns, and then, audaciously, to the very 8.5-inch by 11-inch multi-use acid-free paper on which the workplace discourse is pitilessly inscribed. Cathy liked that, pitilessly. That night, the essay induced an unpleasant dream of turds in bathwater. Don't read about coprophilia before bed was one explanation, but Cathy did feel somehow soiled or sullied. I don't know why I'm writing about coprophilia all the time. I didn't realise I had to.
Now, you may be wondering, who is this Cathy that appears in Crudo? And fascinating that Crudo, the way that you went about it, you have a first-person I, which is you, but there's also a third person who might be Cathy Acker, the writer, maybe, who's doing the things that you've done. So there's a strange kind of tension and exchange between the two of you. But
Well, it's the same as the Nicholas thing. It's injecting somebody
Yeah.
into a moment and then seeing what happens. Just that one fictional thing, and then everything else almost very sort of rigorously observed, but forcing something that's unreal in first.
what Cathy Acker did, I think that connection between the two, really interesting. What Cathy Acker did, if you're not familiar with Cathy Acker, is that she used to appropriate material from other people. She just steal stuff, basically, and just kind of insert it into her own text. The one kind of version of the cut-up that she just takes some stuff and there it would appear. And you're not doing that exactly, but there is this kind of the borrowing of things, the kind of researching of things which can then be inserted, this real fictional tension again. In this climate of anxiety about appropriation, certainly about plagiarism, which I'm sure you're all endlessly talked to about, what are the risks and what are the gains, what are the rewards, what's the excitement in doing that borrowing?
So, what Cathy Acker did, she had this very specific exercise she was given when she was doing a creative writing course with David Antrim, the poet, and he would send them out and he'd say, pick up a text, pick Don Quixote off the library shelves and rewrite it from the first person, force the I into it, and then see what happens as you tell that story. And that's the beginning of Cathy Acker, the pirate, the plagiarist, that she keeps doing that with book after book. I am Toulouse-Lautrec. What happens if I start to say that? So it's very creative. She's not a plagiarist in the sort of way of, I'm completely culturally impoverished, I can't think of anything to write, I'm going to steal somebody else's thing and pass it off as mine. She's playing with stuff that already exists, but she's changing it. And there is no other writer I could have used to write that book. It couldn't have been anybody else, because her work completely gives permission. She says, take freely, use it, reapply it, see what happens. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to force Cathy Acker into the 21st century and see what happens. So the I is me, but the I is absolutely this Cathy character that has some of her biography, some of mine spliced together, and then I'll put her through my gaze and I'll see what happens. And then take bits of her writing and apply them to the present moment. And of course, Cathy Acker is somebody who would be utterly unsurprised by Trump, understood exactly what that kind of grotesque, cartoonish dictator was. Her work is already speaking to that kind of moment. So it's the same thing as bringing somebody that I think is necessary from the past into our times and facing them, confronting them with what's happening now.
I noted that you are writing a lot about artists, obviously, but particularly collagists. You seem completely fascinated by the idea of the glue and the sticking and the cutting and the assembling things. So you write about Joseph Cornell, we've talked about David already, Andy Warhol did it to a degree. I mean, he actually stuck himself back together again, having been shot. He was literally sort of stitched up and placed himself in a corset for the rest of his life. But this idea then of the collage, I felt that you were doing that throughout all these, and then you're kind of collaging them all together. So there's this kind of cross-book conversation, as well as this wonderful kind of assemblage in the Silver Book of things being spliced and cut and glued and stuck. Is that something that you're conscious of doing?
Yeah, and I always want them to be choral. I think that's right back to the first question that you asked about, you know, that they're not biography, they're not memoir. I don't want to just give you, the reader, my version of any of these areas of human existence. With loneliness, to take one example, I could feel that I'd entered this strange psychic realm that was also social, that was political, that was cultural, and I knew there were other people out there, and I wanted to try and look at it from lots of different people's perspectives. And I think also textually, I wanted to have multiple different voices. I don't want it to always be my voice. So there's often lots of quoting in my books. There's a sense that suddenly somebody starts speaking from the past, and you even get that actually in the Silver Book, that there's 2 places in the book where Pasolini speaks in his own words. Some of the time I'm just making up his dialogue. I'm trying to, replicate it as closely as I can from listening to him a lot, from reading him a lot. But there are 2 places where he actually speaks into the 21st century, because the warnings that he was making, the analysis that he was making, felt so pertinent. And I think that sense of it not just being about me, and me not being the only person who's in control of the narrative, feels ethically and politically important, as well as creatively extremely exciting.
And extraordinarily powerful from the reader's point of view. And you do want the reader to do some work, thank goodness. You have high expectations of us as we're reading your work. But that reference to Pasolini and the prescience with which he detected the state that we would be in at some future date, it happens to be now. Do you want to just read, and here we are, do you want to just read that section where he kind of asks that question of us? We initially see Danilo thinking about the costumes, how he's going to design the outfits for the poor abused girls locked up in Salò. But then there's this wonderfully quizzical section which is very powerful at the end of Pasolini.
Yeah. So this is Danilo at night. He's working on 2 films at this point. He's doing Casanova in the day, and he's doing Salò at night. And he's come in, he's looking at the costumes hanging on the rack. Can clothes be evil? The libertines will begin the film in suits. At the end, they'll wear these dressing gowns. Both are garments of power. The law of the father extends through all spheres, outside and in, from the bedroom to the factory, the government, the bank. There is no alternative, not in the world Pasolini is depicting. Within this world, no other exists except as something to be debased. He checks the frogging at a wrist. He's making clothes for rapists who will never be indicted, clothes for murderers who will reappear in the next government, still wearing the same shit-eating grin. Everybody knows it. Nobody says anything. How people will hate this film. At the same time, he knows that it is also Pasolini tearing his own heart out after Ninetto, the boy he loved more than even his mother. To lose your love is one thing. Losing to marriage, not another. He knows that the film is a true story about how things are, the terrifying ugliness of unchecked power, and at the same time it is a vision drained of colour by its maker's own despair. It's a bloodletting, an exsanguination, the reenactment of a real wound inflicted 3 years earlier. There's no love, no sweetness, no exchange, only sex as an exhibition of dominance, sex as a source of pain. It's like this black satin he's rubbing between his fingers, the warp-faced and the weft. 2 things at once, inextricably interlinked. The film is an autobiography of loss. The film is a history of now. There is no such thing as the past, Pasolini likes to say. It constantly invades the present. Danilo believes this is true. He knows what happened in Salò isn't over. He knows how easily it could return. Fascism never really went away. It just changed form, went underground, periodically exploding back into the daylight. If you believe Pasolini, if you read the articles he's been publishing in Corriere, the signs are everywhere. The bombing in Milan in 1969, the attempted coup in 1970, the bombing in Brescia last May, only 20 miles from Salò. All these things signify that fascism is still alive, still straining at the leash. But Danilo knows too, with the same kind of sideways seeing, that his friend is in hell, that he is totally alone, and that the film is coming from this desperate place, this place of desolation. If it's hard to watch, how much harder to live? Make the film, he thinks to himself. Make it like an exorcism. Then let's see where we are.
Yes, let's see where we are. I think this is a really good time for questions. So let me put my glasses on, because otherwise I won't be able to see you at all. So who's got a question?
Oh, yes, there's one.
So I'm just curious about how you approach not just writing about artists, but writing about that visual experience. I love what you said earlier about that constant desire to kind of translate, almost be like a medium to get offer this visual experience to the reader. Do you have a way in which you go about trying to either research that or kind of brainstorm how you might offer that experience to a reader when writing about visual art?
God, that's such a good question. I think it's just a constant process of trying to make it work, trying to make it feel alive. I spend lots of time with artists who don't work with language, who work with images or who make things, and I try and sort of spy as much as I can on what they're doing. And then just my background is journalism, not creative writing, and I think the great gift of journalism is just very, very detailed attention, that sort of discipline of taking notes. What kind of colour is that exactly? What kind of texture is that exactly? And having this resource that you can go back on. If you go and look in an archive, do an interview, it's so intense in your head that you feel like you'll remember it forever. But if you've got a notebook where you've written down the colour of the carpet, in 2 years' time when you're writing it up, you will be so grateful for that detail, because that's the thing that grounds it in the real, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. It's the grounding in the real, which is, we are material bodies moving through a material world, and I think we're logging those kind of things with our eyes all the time, so you have to give the reader that. Yeah, it's something I think about all the time. Then there's a thing there.
You were talking about certain things feeling transgressive. You were talking about kind of a death or a murder. I was wondering where you draw the line and where your confidence comes from feeling like you've drawn the line in the right place.
I think, again, it's a process of constantly questioning, and like I said earlier, the going on instinct, that if something feels sort of trashy or cheap or as if I've betrayed somebody, then that feels to me like I've crossed the line. This question really became sort of very live for me when I was writing The Trip to Echo Spring, which is about alcoholism, where I knew that I was telling really horrible details about people's lives and people's behaviour in the throes of addiction. And that's where it started feeling like the sort of ethical process that I wanted to go through with that book, and I think it's continued, is if I'm saying things about other people, I need to be saying things about myself, so I need to be having that level of honesty. I didn't love talking about my own experiences in an alcoholic family, and to be honest, I didn't love saying how extremely lonely I was. But it's like the, it's like the sort of almost, blood that you give to be able to tell the story. I think if it's not costing you something and it's just costing other people something, then probably something is off in that balance. But I also think it's entirely a conversation between the writer's own self or being. It can't be judged from outside. I don't think.
Do you think it's the same between fiction and your non-fiction?
No, it's definitely the same.
Yeah.
It's the same. Yeah. And I can't imagine writing, because it needs to feel high stakes. So I think even if there weren't real people in fiction, it would still need to feel that you weren't sort of creating cheap shocks for the sake of cheap moments of sentiment, that it has to feel like the weighting of it is right. This is all instinctive, and I think everyone has their own instinctive sense of when they're making something that feels real, that feels alive, and when they're making something that feels like it's just a cheap simulacrum. And that can only be your ear and your sense. This is someone. You and them.
Thank you. So, as you were speaking in both, having read Crudo in particular, hearing you use the language of stealing, and that being very Acaresque, But also you were saying, I steal from the landscape, I don't steal from here, and that involving a certain ethics. And while that is Accaresque, it sounds to me that it also seems to be in conversation with somebody who was also writing at Acca's time, Helen Sixou. While Acca has remained hugely popular, Sixou's become deeply unfashionable, and I wonder if you have ever been in conversation with her.
Well, I went to Sussex University in the 1990s, where we got a lot of Sixou, we got a lot of Lacan, we got a lot of Foucault, and I think all of that is still in my head. All of that moment of critical theory and the excitement of that, the excitement of being able to sort of take Jane Eyre and pull it apart, that sort of thrill that the text isn't dead, it's alive and it keeps going, and you can be an artist that plays with that does something different with that. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment.
Thank you so much, Vicky. But Olivia, when you were talking, as an artist, I kind of felt so much about, that kind of resonance with your process. The way you talk about this sort of connection with artists and collage, and just it feels very process driven. And I just wonder whether that is something that is very that you're conscious of that within your practice as a writer, that it is also about the process, like the time you spent in Rome, that kind of, and there's a lot of reflection obviously that goes in there, that comes with that, but this sort of, it feels very process driven, and which is, I immediately feel a connection. I haven't read this book, but when you're talking about film as well, these are all kind of very process-driven mediums as well.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether that's a conscious thing or whether it's...
Yeah, I think it is, and I think with Crudo in particular, I had very strict rules. Like, I set up these guidelines. I had to write every day. I couldn't edit. That's why it's called Crudo. It's raw. That is completely a first draft. And I like making those sort of, that's much more a kind of visual art exercise than a writing exercise, or writing in the current climate. That is really a thing that people are so interested in doing, but it feels very exciting and profitable to me to have, okay, this is the container, and then anything can happen within that container. I like to have a sense that there's some sort of limitation. And I think with this one as well, often these books, here they are, they exist, they've got covers, but when I'm starting to write something, I'm not thinking this is going to be a published book. I'm thinking this is a crazy dare to myself. This is really high risk, and it's okay because no one will ever know that I messed it up. And with Crudo, very much, I remember sending it to my agent, who's sitting here halfway through, and she's like, "Thanks for sending me your holiday diary. This is the And then a bit later thought, oh, okay, this is actually more interesting than I'd realised. But I wanted it to have that feeling of, God, this thing really might not fly. This might not take off at all. And then the process becomes the thing that you lose yourself in, and that does start giving a project wings if you're lucky.
Other questions?
I had a question which is kind of a follow-up to that. I was just wondering, given the sort of interdisciplinary aspect of your work, how you kind of make these rules for yourself. Like, how do you decide what the container is going to be? And then how do you kind of every day keep yourself sticking to those rules?
It's sort of impossible to answer, because I think, I don't know, Crudo, I was initially reading the Chris Kraus Kathy Acker biography. I read the description of the David Antrim exercise, and I thought, I'm going to try that. Let's see how that goes. And then set out the rules for myself, and then I just obeyed them. I mean, I guess maybe I'm just really obedient. I didn't want to break them. I like making the challenge, and then I guess maybe something would have come up where it would have felt exciting to break them, but for that it didn't. And I think projects just get their own momentum, you know, you could write about anything in the world and you narrow it down and you narrow it down. And with books like Lonely City, I will write a proposal and it will have this cast of characters and this sort of set of things that I'm going to cover. And then I start writing and that all falls away. Like maybe some of the characters will run through, but mostly it comes out of the archive. I do the research and I realise that, wow, that person knew this person and this person has made work. You have to follow the reality, you have to follow what's really there and keep being incredibly attentive to the book as it's developing. And that's why those things like the coincidence of Clara being on the way to Berlin, I feel like this might sound slightly hippy-dippy, but you start to get a sense that you're on the right track because coincidences start happening, the doors start opening, and that, not that you shouldn't knock on doors that stay closed for a while, but there is a feeling when a book has got momentum that all you have to do is be obedient to that. Now I've said obedient twice.
There's a question here.
And then one there. Yeah, you.
I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the role that travel plays in your writing, because I've read the three kind of, I don't know if you perceive them to be linked, but the three, the Lonely City, the To the River and Echo Springs, and at least two of those you're moving during them, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about the difference between writing something when you're in motion and when you're stood still.
Yeah, it was really big for me at the beginning, was having that travel narrative as a way of creating a sort of momentum and propulsion and a feeling that you were going somewhere, because otherwise it's like, oh, I'm just talking about all of these things and it's such a mishmash. I didn't really know how to write a book at all at the beginning, and that gave me a structure. And I really remember with Echo Spring, I was on a residency and I had this huge board and loads of cards, and I was sort of arranging the cards with bits of stuff about the different characters around a physical journey and trying to work out how I would locate things in different places. And I think after a while I didn't need to do that anymore. I knew how to tell a story, but it took me years. Like, it took me a good couple of books. And by Lonely City I felt like I didn't have to have that for the propulsion, but the building up of the architectural structure of the books is another thing that feels like it's its own sort of separate practice. And then there's the filling in the detail and the kind of fine-tuning, and that's much more about observation. But the structural development is finding some way to tell a narrative and tell a story about an idea, which is, you know, it's a complex translation. There was somebody else. Somebody else put their hand up? It was you. Okay, we believe you.
Yeah, you've sort of like more or less answered what I was going to ask, but I guess from a different angle. I was interested about that transition from non-fiction to fiction in terms of temporal scape and the agency that you have once you slip into non-fiction, and thinking about before you're kind of putting together these constellations from archive figures from different time periods. But what it means, so when you go into non-fiction, then you're not having to stick to a predefined timescale, and you have a bit more temporal agency, and what that transition is like.
That's so funny, because actually both novels have such strict temporal framework, because Credo, like I say, it had to be written every day. It was basically, I think it's a 3-month period, so it's got its own very strict you know, it's almost like a metronome. The days keep falling. There's this sense that the beats are really there, and that was it really is unedited, apart from a couple of things where the editor was like, you need to say what day it is. You just be getting those beats right, so you felt like you understood the structure you're inside. And then this book, getting the timing right was such a lot of work, just to sort of have a sense of what was being filmed when, what set they were in at Cinecittà, on what day, where they were moving around on location. So the time signature, it's actually the same as the travel thing. The time signature sort of took over as being the new way of building that, because it's all counting down to this death. So you're moving sort of closer and closer. I have to make sure that enough happened far away enough, because I'm running out of days, so it's got to move back a bit. I don't know if that answers the question, but there is a real obsession with time in my books.
Yeah.
That in some ways maybe that's the secret subject of what I'm always writing about is time.
One more question before this time runs out.
Yeah.
I suppose, back to transgression. I was curious about how much it came up in this talk and how, of course, it seemed to be framed as naturally a bad thing for you. Didn't want to transgress on Pasolini's real life or Virginia Woolf's real life. But when I think of your writing, I think oftentimes you can see transgression as a value, of course. Is there a sense in which, transgressing on other people's rules is kind of an ethical value, but not transgressing your own is also an ethical value? How do you think of those
Yeah,
concepts?
I think transgression of sort of moral values is the kind of transgression I'm opposed to, and the kind of transgression that a lot of the writers that or artists that I've written about, that's different. That's about sort of social prohibitions that need to be transgressed against. And, Salò is one of the most transgressive films ever made, but in a way it's about a kind of hypocrisy. It's laying bare what a system really means that we all kind of accept and make nice all the time. So I think that kind of transgression is completely different. But that's such a good question to sort of articulate to oneself, not just me, but I think anyone who's making, to think about what kind of social norms or moral ideas need to be kind of torn away or torn down, and which ones you actually want to embody in your writing, because it feels to me like they are very sort of moral books and morally concerned books, but I'm sure lots of people would find them scandalous and repulsive, and in fact one of them has just been banned in Russia. So there is that feeling that the material in them is often shocking, but there should be something, I think, that's really morally alert inside them. These are really good questions. They're really exciting.
Thank you all so much for your brilliant questions. Actually, the best set of questions I think I've ever encountered in a forum like this.
They're high level. I'm really thinking hard.
Top-notch questions. But of course, a huge thank you to Olivia for their brilliance, their erudition, and their